Hi guys. It is a hot, sticky summer day here in the collapse of global industrial civilization here in upstate New York on this soon-to-be sweltering Monday, August 6, 2018. But we're going to go out to the state of Oregon where it might be just as sweltering today, where I have the great honor of speaking with Donald Worster. I have been talking about Donald recently and reading from his 2016 book, Shrinking the Earth, The Rise and Decline of American Abundance, which is one of the best. If you're trying to understand the predicament we find ourselves in at this point, there is no better source than Shrinking the Earth by Donald Worster. Before I bring Donald on, just real quickly from the back jacket, I want to tell you a little bit more about Donald. Donald Worster is Honorary Director of the Center for Ecological History at the University of Renmin, I hope I spelled that right, of China, and Hall Distinguished Professor of American History Emeritus at the University of Kansas, and is the author of many books, which too numerous to mention, but it's really his 2016 book, Shrinking the Earth, The Rise and Decline of American Abundance, that we want to talk about. In this work, acclaimed environmental historian Donald Worster takes a global view in his examination of the ways in which complex issues of worldwide abundance and scarcity have shaped American society over 3 centuries, looking at the limits nature imposes on human ambitions. He questions whether America today is in the midst of a shift from a culture of abundance to a culture of limits, and whether American consumption has become reliant on the global South. Worster engages with key political, economic, and environmental thinkers while presenting his own interpretation of the role of capitalism and government in issues of wealth, abundance, and scarcity. Acknowledging the Earth's agency throughout human history, Shrinking the Earth offers a compelling explanation of how we have arrived where we are and a hopeful way forward on a planet that is no longer as large as it once was. And Donald Worster, that was quite a mouthful. So say hello to the folks, and then I guess we'll just dive right into it.
Well, hello, folks. I am in Oregon, and it is gorgeous out here this morning, as it always is, it seems, in the summer here. It's not hot and sticky. It's fresh, cool, dry, and the temperatures overnight are down in the 50s, and right now it's about 70 degrees out here.
So no wildfire
this is a great
smoke.
place to be, and I hope we can keep it this way.
So no wildfire smoke where you are?
No, not yet. It is true. We were having some big forest fires the last few summers, and this one is no exception. And most of them are farther south, and the smoke has not been bad here. Last summer, about this time, it was pretty bad, and in fact, the air quality in Corvallis, which is where I'm sitting, was about as bad as in Beijing.
Yeah, I was up there last summer. I remember that. So speaking of Beijing, real quickly, you spend about 5 months a year in China. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm on the faculty of Renmin University of China, the People's University they call it, which is in Beijing. I'm part of the School of History there. I'm not really a full-time member. I come and go, but since I'm retired from my American academic career, but I have found a whole new set of interests and experiences and perspectives in the time I've been spending in China. It's a phenomenal place and phenomenally interesting.
I imagine it is. Hopefully, we'll have time in this short interview to talk about China for a little bit. But right now, can you give us a 5 minute summation of your book, Shrinking the Earth? Just in a nutshell, how did we get into the predicament here, both in this country and on this planet, that we find ourselves in today? Is there a simple way to answer that complicated question?
Well, I'll tell you, at the end of 5 minutes, you kind of clear your throat now and know when to stop. I'm an historian. I've been writing about environmental history of the United States and the world for some years. I've written on very specific topics in the United States, even a couple of big biographies in recent years. But I really wanted to step back and look at the broader picture. A lot of historians are trying to do that these days to get a more world or global sense of things. There's a lot of books out there of this sort. But I've always been convinced that historians tend to take for granted, to pay lip service to it, but they take for granted the significance of Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the New World. And so I started with that as my question. What were the consequences of that? And what does it look like from our perspective today? And when I look back to 1492 and really the whole age of discovery, what is quite clear to me is that the world of civilized, very developed societies, and those are, difficult words to define, but basically Western Europe, Asia, had fallen, had just like a windfall from a tree of apples, after a windstorm. This immense, whole new, basically, planet. I call it actually the second Earth, because it was just like that. It was fully equivalent in size to the first Earth, and it was just loaded with natural resources. They have been exploited by the native peoples, but not nearly as exploited intensely as, for the most part, you'd see in, say, Western Europe or China. This all falls into the laps of the Europeans, and it takes them a long time to figure out what its significance is. But I think that basically we can say modern history began there. It began with the unwinding, the unfolding of the significance and the material significance and the emotional and the intellectual significance of that huge effect. Of course, it's happened before in history. People wander into a new valley, a new landscape, and things begin to change. Things begin to happen for them. But this was on a scale unprecedented. Adam Smith said it was the most important thing in the history of the human species, and I think he was right. So what are the consequences? That's what I started thinking about, and how do they connect up to today? And when I look at today, I see books being written everywhere about the Earth is shrinking, the Earth is endangered. So what's happened? Well, basically, we came, we saw, and we exploited, and now we're at the end of that cycle, and we've got to come to terms with the fact that there is no third Earth somewhere on this planet to discover. The only possibilities for us lie in outer space, and they're not very great possibilities at that when you start thinking about the difficulties of getting to those places. It's not like Columbus. It's going to take a lot more time, and it's not going to have the same kind of effect if it ever happens at all. Certainly not in our lifetime or the next 100, perhaps even 200 years will we expect anything like this to come along. So we've got for the foreseeable future to live on this planet that we have now completely discovered, in the sense of basic natural resources. We know where most of it is. We have populated it. There are 1 billion people now living in the Western Hemisphere. The biggest and most powerful nation in the world is in this hemisphere now, the United States. So it really falls on Americans particularly, I think, to say, where are we now? How do we safeguard where we are? How do we learn to live within the limits of this planet that is It's now become much smaller than it was in 1492.
Okay, well, one thing you talk about at length, and I'm glad you do in your book, is the limits to growth, which was written originally, I believe, in 1972 and updated in the 1990s. Could you just recap for the few of us listening to this who are not familiar with the limits to growth studies and their conclusions, and just your general opinion of the limits to growth, and are their predictions bearing out here in 2018 as did they call it right?
Well, the Limits to Growth was a small book published in 1972. The key authors on it were Donella and Dennis Meadows. Donella is deceased. Dennis is still alive, retired in New Hampshire. They were living in Cambridge at that time, and they got funding from the Volkswagen Foundation and the Club of Rome to look at the whole planet. This was in the same year as the first global environmental conference at Stockholm. So everybody was talking about where is this planet going and how can we survive on it. They came out with their book, which was based on a lot of extrapolations into the future. If this trend continues, if that trend continues, and so forth, where will they take us in 50 to 100 years? And their argument was that we were running up against planetary limits in natural resources, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb our pollutants, and so forth. A lot of it was population, but a lot of it was also simply consumption or even simply bad technology that was polluting the planet. So they made all these extrapolations. The economists didn't like it because basically it was calling into question the fundamental, I suppose, philosophy, ideology, commitment that modern economics has, which is to infinite economic growth.
On a finite planet.
On a finite planet. Of course, economists have all agreed that it's a finite planet. How could they do otherwise? But nonetheless, they say the limits are a long way off. So that's always the question. When will those limits be reached? The Meadows really had no specific overall answer to that question. They extrapolated into the 21st century, and they said that within about 100 years, that is around 2172, whatever we are here, 2072, I should say, we would be reaching the limits of a large number of key natural resources. So we're a little bit off from most of those dates that they were projecting, but those projections were highly tentative. The larger picture was that we can see we're pressing up against the systems that support life on this earth. They even mentioned the climate system, but they also talked about freshwater supplies. They talked about pollution, absorption of pollution, etc. So it was, in some ways, one of the first books about thinking about the earth as a set of global systems, physical systems, material, chemical, etc., etc., and of course biology, biota, the food chains. How much of it stands up today? Well, there have been studies that run their figures and say we're still on track for what they're talking about. That is, in every way, we have gone beyond what they said toward more and more, into more and more dangerous situations. We are closer than we were when they wrote to the depletion of fossil fuel supplies on this earth. We are closer to this, we're closer to that. But nobody has any absolute date in mind. I think the more important question, though, and it got obscured in all of this, is we shouldn't be talking simply about growth, because what is growth? I mean, growth is a biological metaphor, but as it's used in economics, some people think it means more wealth. But in fact, it really means, as far as I can determine, increase in the number of financial transactions that are being made. Those financial transactions can be paying to clean up pollution, etc. So it's a completely obscure kind of what it's actually measuring is pretty simple. They count the number of financial transactions going on in the world, and we call that an increase in well-being. Many economists are beginning to question the whole idea of growth. So I kind of put that finally aside a little bit. I think it's a word that needs to be thought through very carefully, not just used as a slogan as it is by most governments.
Well, let's talk about its corollary, the decline. So what I know that it took an entire book to write this, and again, I highly recommend this book, Shrinking the Earth, to anyone. Decline of American abundance. Are we seeing that already, or are we heading into an era minimally where we're going to have to start seeing a decline of American abundance? Talk about that term for a minute.
Okay. Well, I have to say that the publishers changed the title to American Abundance, and in the paperback edition, which has just come out, it is now reading Natural Abundance, because it's not just an American problem. And abundance has many meanings in itself. I'm talking about one kind of abundance, not mass production, abundance coming off assembly lines, although it's connected to what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what we could say the wealth of nature. How much fresh water is flowing on the planet? How many fish are in the ocean? How many forests and trees are growing? How many are we losing? What is the air capacity? How much oxygen can we breathe without it's free of pollution, etc.? Those kinds of things, and also including material resources that we mine, that are hidden in the earth. Those would be, I think, all part of what I would call natural abundance. But perhaps the most important of all, soil. Soil, soil that can raise food for the population. So it's a human-centered idea, of course.
It all is.
But it is testing. Sorry?
I said it usually is a human-centered idea. So we are, in your opinion, I mean, today in 2018, as we just had the earliest Earth overshoot day in history, not surprisingly, a few days ago, you see a decline of nature's abundance. How do you see that shaping up over the coming decades? Is that decline in abundance going to get steeper?
Well, it depends on your time frame. The next few decades, it's going to get worse. There's going to be less arable soil to support our populations. There's going to be a lot fewer birds, plants, all kinds of creatures in our food chains on which we depend. There's going to be less fresh water per person on this planet. There's going to be less clean air, etc. I mean, all those things seem to be pretty clear over the next 50 years, and that's due to two things. One is, this is Paul Ehrlich's famous equation, population plus consumption. We have 7 billion people. We're going on probably to 10 and perhaps 12. Most prognostications that I've read suggest that by about the middle of this century, human population will reach a tabling off point. That is, the births and deaths will pretty well balance, and population will not continue to increase any longer. That's another extrapolation that has lots of imponderables in it. But my own hunch is that it's not likely to do that. It's actually likely to reach a tabling point, but it will not table. It will start to decline. And so if you look out 100 years from now or 200 years from now, I think there's a very strong likelihood that the human population will be much diminished. There are people in Austria who have run those figures and say that within 200 years, our population, the human population, may be back to what it was in the year 1800. Maybe that's too hopeful for some people, but I can't make any judgment on that. But it just seems to me that most things that go up, and they don't stay up all the rest of eternity. They start coming down. All species populations have a life cycle, and ours probably has one too.
Do you see
As
this
far
as
consumption,
okay?
Yes, go ahead.
With population, before we move on to consumption, do you see this as a gradual or a stair-step decline, or do you see this as what more and more people talk about, the falling over the cliff, rapid, abrupt decline in human population due to us hitting the limits of the planet?
Well, certainly it's much more rapid than anybody expected. Whether it were falling off a cliff in that sense, I don't know. But the population, the fertility levels, and all over the world are coming down at a remarkably quick rate compared to what people thought back in the 1970s. Or I suppose Paul Ehrlich thought back in the 1960s when he wrote The Population Bomb. That's good news. You can find anecdotal evidence, you can find global statistics that show how smaller families have become very, very quickly. In Zimbabwe, country in the news right now, 20 years ago, it was 8 children per family. It's not that anymore. I don't know exactly what it is, but I've met people over there who had no children, who were determined not to have children. Something I've read that 40% of the world's population now live in zero-growth societies. That's zero for fertility, and that includes, most importantly, China. And China, its population is still increasing, but the number of children per family there has been down for quite a while. 1 child per family, whatever it is going to be in the future. So if we can, there are countries that are in negative population growth. Italy, Japan, probably.
Well, since you mentioned China and you were just getting ready to go into consumption, and obviously you are, of anybody I've ever interviewed, you have personal on-the-ground knowledge of what you see in China. Talk about, let's use this as a springboard to talk about consumption. So China's population gets cut in half, and the consumption of the per capita consumption of each person doubles. We have made no gains. Talk about the overconsumption and the people coming out of poverty, particularly in China and more India, and what that is going to mean for the state of the planet over the balance of the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, China has 1.5 billion people, 1/4 of the population of the earth. My estimate is about 300 to 400 million of those people now live basically in a Western style of living. They've got automobiles, they live in cities, they have shopping malls everywhere, restaurants, the whole lifestyle. And I can't criticize them for wanting that, which Americans enjoy, etc. I wish for people in China were much more thoughtful and careful about what they're going for, but I want them to have a better condition of life, but I don't think they need to have a Maserati or a BMW, in every garage. But there's a huge number of people, at least 300 or 400 million on the other end of the spectrum, who are living in incredibly impoverished rural areas, who are making at best a couple of $1,000s a year. And overall, the Chinese per capita income is about 1/4 or 1/5 that of the United States. So they're a long way from being able to consume across the board nationally on anything like the American scale. And I don't think they're ever going to get there. I don't think they can afford to keep on increasing the number of automobiles. The government, that's a key parameter right there. How many automobiles you own? The streets, the ring roads around Beijing are jammed with cars, and this has resulted in a large part of the pollution problems. The government knows this. It has imposed basically a lottery system on new car ownership. You have to enter your name in a lottery and hope your number comes up. If you get an electric car, there aren't any restrictions. But if you try to get a gasoline automobile, it's just about hopeless right now to get one.
Oh, really?
So China is imposing some restrictions on some kinds of consumption. But it is now basically into the Western capitalist mode of increasing growth, etc. But here's the thing. How long can China sustain this? There's a book out that I haven't yet been able to get my hands on and read. It's called China's Limits to Growth. But China has basically very limited natural resources of its own. It's got some things that it hasn't yet exploited, but it has been picked over by civilized, technologically advanced people for, 5,000 years, certainly 3,000. There's not much left out there.
Yeah.
Now the problem is really to restore some of its forest cover, its river quality, and so on. But in terms of mineable natural resources, China is going all over the world searching to get them. Their greatest hope is that they can exploit Africa and bring home all that stuff from Africa. It will be their third Earth.
They think.
But that's crazy.
Talk about, if you would, what do you know about this, which is even making it into the mainstream media, this whole new Belt and Road initiative? Could you tell us, in your understanding, what is this Belt and Road initiative, and what does it mean for the planet as China marches forward with this?
Sam, I don't know what it means, because the Chinese government hasn't been very clear about all the aspects of it. I do know this, that if I criticize it too loudly, I can get myself, but even more of my colleagues.
Yeah, okay, we will.
The Chinese government is not. Yeah, no, but I can say a few things.
Okay.
The Belt and Road Initiative is basically to create an infrastructure that will bring all kinds of resources into China, increase trade throughout Asia, Africa, and to some extent even North America. Somebody has proposed building a new super train that will go from Beijing across the Bering Strait into Alaska and into the United States. So, but it's mainly through Southeast Asia over to Africa and into Siberia to build an infrastructure that would allow commodities, resources to be traded back and forth. Much of them, of course, going to China. And it will cost trillions of dollars to accomplish this, which means it probably won't happen, not on the scale that has been promised. But the Chinese government is really behind this. It's at international conferences, thousands of people coming in from all kinds of countries to talk about it, getting loans. Some of it's already collapsing. The projects, there's one in Malaysia that the government is backing away from there. Other countries are wondering if they're being just sold a bill of goods. The Africans are getting more skeptical about some of these huge mega projects that the Chinese want to fund. Westerners, including the United States, have been doing this for years over in these countries. And so if China is going to have about the same success, I suppose, which is to say, nearly as much as they hope or expect. But the potential here for environmental damage is huge. Incredible. I mean, they're going to putting railroads and airports and so forth in places that are basically wild areas or lightly used by people. The ecological impact could be monstrously large. And there's no impact statement here. There's no analysis being done at this point that we know of. At the same time, the Chinese government is touting itself as the first future ecological civilization. It's going to find a way to harmonize technology, civilization, and nature, etc. Find harmony is their key word. They have conferences on this all the time. And I think the government of China takes it seriously, more seriously than our government in the United States is taking it right now.
That's a pretty low bar.
Well, I would put it even farther back. I never heard Barack Obama talking about building an ecological civilization.
No, we won't even get on that. Let's don't get derailed on all of that. I want to. Good Lord, we are already over 30 minutes into this. I want to read one paragraph from your book. So give people. I have read this paragraph out before, but it certainly bears repeating. In your book, Shrinking the Earth, in your epilogue, which you title Life on a Pale Blue Dot, in the final pages of your book, this, I think, is the most important paragraph in the book as a segue into the future. So I'm just going to read this and then have you expand upon it and just take a rip on it for a few minutes. So let me read this and then we'll hear your comments. What new ideas and institutions will emerge on the earth as we are now beginning to understand it? A decisive material fact of our time is that our home planet is ecologically shrinking because of our growing technology, population, and consumption. While its average diameter still measures 8,000 miles and its surface area is still about 200 million square miles, Earth's capacity to support life has not increased. In fact, it has diminished. The global systems that have long sustained the evolution of life and human civilization are being seriously disturbed by our numbers and activities. Those systems can no longer sustain the demands we make on them. Ideas and institutions are being intensely challenged by that predicament, and eventually they will crack apart. Now, you wrote those words probably 3 years ago now. You wrote those, and where is our predicament? What do you mean that our ideas and institutions will eventually crack apart? And just take a rip on that for a few minutes, Donald.
Okay. Well, to do that, I need to go back to the book, the earlier part of the book, to basically the 18th century, when people began to contemplate the full consequences of the discovery of the Western Hemisphere by Western civilization. And out of that, they began to realize had come revolutionary changes. We've sort of forgotten this. Historians don't pay that much attention to the connection between the great discoveries of the Western Hemisphere and the revolutions that began to take place in Europe. And so I identify 5 of them in the book. One of them has to do with the rise of capitalism. I don't think capitalism is even conceivable as a way of life, an ideology, and its institutions without the discovery of the New World and all that made possible. The Industrial Revolution, which follows much later, but nonetheless, you think of it as just isolated. It happened only in Europe. It could not have happened, it seems to me, without the impact of the Western Hemisphere, the discovery of that. And then there are other consequences, like all these democratic revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, others that began to follow. New ideas about politics, equality, freedom, the whole modern liberal worldview, progress, etc. The relations between nations. China had been the dominant power on the globe up until that discovery, and then suddenly the West begins to rise, and out of that comes the United States. And then the final one that I think is perhaps the most important of all was the scientific revolution. It follows within a few decades, it begins from the discovery of the New World. And Copernicus and Newton and eventually Charles Darwin, and all that whole stream of people. So when I keep all these things cracking apart, I'm talking about what's going to happen to all those revolutions. What is going to happen to capitalism? What's going to happen to our ideas about democracy? What's going to happen to the power and dominance of science in our lives? These are and the relationships between nations. Will China take place again as the number one nation on the earth by inventing a new kind of culture, an ecological civilization that we are not able to do or can't bring ourselves about to do it? So those are big questions that I think have to be addressed. And I think we are living in a time that is basically asking itself, what kind of revolutions do we need for this post-natural abundance planet?
Do you want to answer that question? Let's write. I want to read one. I just want to read the last paragraph, and then this from your prologue. Since we were in your epilogue, let's go back to your prologue. What will be the future for those real people who live in the once new world that has become an old world? What will it be for those who always had to experience that world from afar, never directly and close up? The work of history offers no prophecies about what comes next. So I realize you are a historian, Donald Worcester. You're not a prophet. But I think you probably have your finger on the pulse more than 99% of the people, even those who call themselves prophets. So I'm not going to ask you to make predictions, but Donald Worcester, you have to have somewhere in your own mind some vision of how this is going to play out in terms of human civilization and on a larger backdrop, the ecological dismantling of this planet. So let's hear your vision. Let's hear your vision as much as you can share with us.
My hope would be, naturally, I want to keep most of the institutions and ideas I've grown up with. I don't want to forsake ideas of liberalism and democracy. I don't want to see science come to an end. I don't really want to see capitalism ending abruptly and totally into some sort of, communistic future. No, I don't really want to see those sort of things happen, but I know that those institutions and ideas have got to come to grips with the change. So here's what I would hope to see. I'd like to see a capitalism that is green in a really thorough, deep-going way, that accepts that we live in a no-growth world, that we have to acknowledge the importance of natural resources, protect our habitats and ecology of this planet, and finds its profit, its ways of making money in protecting as much as in exploiting. That's an idealistic idea, perhaps, but I think it's up to the business community to show us whether it can do that or not. And if it cannot, then we've got to go to something else. I suspect we're going to have to, in all of this, nonetheless, find ways to redistribute the wealth on this planet. We cannot, having exploited so much of it, now sit on it in the West and say it's all ours. Of course, much of it was exploited in the New World belongs to people in the New World, you could say, but it's going to have to be distributed. And there are people at the bottom of societies in every country who are not going to be able to get their share of this in any way, to any measure, without a redistribution of wealth. That's going to require a lot of political, governmental interaction across the planet. Nations getting together, working together, the exact opposite of what the mood is in many countries today, which is just going back into nationalistic fervor. We're going to have to figure out ways to work together to safeguard and also to distribute what we have in the way of beauty and abundance on this planet. As far as science is concerned, I think the change has already taken place there. Science is going through a dramatic change. It once was basically a tool of empire. It was basically for exploitation. But at this point, I think clearly the scientific community is coming alive to the problems we have in climate change and so forth, and is becoming more and more concerned about protecting, discovering the parameters and the limits and so forth that we have to deal with. So I think we can probably see a future in which science plays an even more important role and a very different ethical and moral role in society. So that's quite broad and general, I know, but you asked me in a few minutes.
Well, that's what you want to see. I mean, and who can? Well, some people could probably argue with that. I cannot argue with one single word of that. But let's in your heart, do you see that what you want to see? Is it wishful thinking on your part, or are we going to find the political will on this planet to do what needs to be done in time before this whole thing unravels?
Well, of course that's not clear, but I can say this. Every historian that I've known has been studying how countries, cultures, civilizations collapse and are reborn in some understanding change. And the one thing we can say is we've been there before. We have made changes. The whole set of revolutions I just talked about back in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries happened. I mean, people didn't expect them. They couldn't predict it, but it happened. And I'm sure we're going to go through revolutions. There's no question we're going to go through revolutions again. And they may end up becoming what I like, or they may not. We may end up in a more authoritarian society, as many people are already predicting. But here is the main point. Humans are a very adaptive species, and I suspect we're going to adapt and find new institutions and ideas. And I think if we concentrate on the fact that we are experienced in change, we've been experienced for at least 50,000 years in adapting to new environments, living with scarcity, living with abundance, etc. We can adapt, and we will. And what needs to happen at this point is not for somebody like me to say, here's what my blueprint is, but to have thinking communities get together, begin taking these things seriously and talking about them and having discussions across the disciplines and across communities and getting people into the conversation, because I think there is no wisdom for this except the wisdom of the whole.
Well, that is exactly what we're trying to do in our tiny little way on Collapse Chronicles, and we really appreciate your voice in the mix. And don't hang up when we wrap this up. I want to talk to you briefly after we finish. But how I wrap up every one of these conversations is pretend like you're not talking to Sam Mitchell at Collapse Chronicles, where you can go on for 45 minutes, but by some absolute miracle, Donald Worcester, you have the mainstream media sticking a microphone in your face, and you have 60 seconds to tell the world what you want to say to the world. What would that 60-second mainstream media soundbite sound like?
We've only got one planet. It's a fairly familiar idea. We've only got one planet, and we've got to save it. For as far as we can see, this is where we're going to live. This is our home. And whatever we are and whatever we want to become is going to come out of this planet. And we want to safeguard that as our fundamental basis of life.
Well, there you go. That didn't even take 60 seconds. You summed that up very well in about 30. So, do you have a website that, or anything like that, specifically dedicated to the rest of your work? that we can find more about you?
No, I'm afraid I don't. But you could go onto Amazon and find the books that I've written over the years. There are about 10 of them, going back to books on the ideas of ecology, et cetera, et cetera. So people can find them on Amazon or other sources. But I've really had a good time talking to you, Sam, and I hope I have brought a little bit of hopefulness into this general picture, because I think there is a lot of reason to be optimistic if people really can get comfortable with change instead of fighting and getting angry and wanting to kill each other.
Yes, okay. Well, Donald Mercer, one more time, thank you very much for taking this time out of your busy schedule early on Monday morning. That's amazing. This man, this is at like 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, folks, that this man had this conversation. So we want to thank you for the good job you do, and keep up the good fight, and come back and talk to us sometime.
All right, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.